The wagon ruts ended where the granite began, and that was where Hattie Vane first understood what she had bought. She was 23 years old. She had been a widow since April. She had $43 folded into the lining of her coat, a trunk of bedding behind her, and a 6-month-old daughter named Ada, asleep against her chest, breathing the small, even breaths of a child who did not yet know the world could be cruel. The cabin rose out of the lodgepole pine in the last light of an August afternoon, 16 feet by 18. Hand-hewn logs gone silver with weather. The chinking between them cracked and crumbling, leaving thin black gaps a man could pass a finger through. A stovepipe leaned slightly off true. The roof shingles had curled where the sun had worked on them too many summers, and beside the door where firewood should have stood, stacked to the eaves against the coming cold, there was only a rectangle of bare dirt, not depleted, empty. She stood looking at it a long moment. The grass had grown back inside its edges. Whoever had taken the wood or used the last of it had done so a long time ago. She had paid $8 in Missoula for the deed to this place on the word of a clerk who had described it as sound construction, previous owner relocated. The clerk had not mentioned a woodpile, and she had not known to ask. The freighter, a square-jawed man named Cobb, set her trunk down in the dust beside her. He looked at the empty woodpile. He looked at her. He looked at the baby. Then he looked back at the woodpile, as if to be sure he had seen it right the first time. "Ma'am," he said, "I've hauled for 40 years up and down this valley. I don't usually say a thing." He paused long enough that she understood he was choosing his words. "You're making a mistake." Hattie had heard this before. She had heard it from the land agent's clerk in Missoula, who had taken her $8 and would not meet her eyes. She had heard it from a woman at the boarding house who had pressed a small jar of preserves into her hands and said, "God watch over that child." She would hear it many more times before the snow came, and each time it would land a little harder, like a man tapping the same bruise over and over, until the flesh beneath went black. "The previous owner," she said. "What happened to him?" Cobb spat to the side. The mules shifted in their traces, ready to be moving. "Mund, Silas Mund, worked the mill down at Hamilton years and years. Never spoke at the meals. Never drank at the bunkhouse. Never borrowed a thing nor lent a thing." He shook his head. "Spent his Sundays up here alone. Every Sunday as long as anyone could remember. Hammering at something in that loft. Wouldn't let a living soul inside pass the threshold." He climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered his reins. One spring he just didn't come down to work. They went looking. Found him in his bunk at the mill. Heart, they figured. He'd left this place to no one. The agent took the claim and sold it on. Sold it to you. She looked at the cabin, at the small window in the gable end covered with oiled paper, gone amber with age. At the door standing open where she had pushed it open an hour before. A single room, a cast-iron box stove on flagstones, a rope bed against the far wall, a small table the dead man had built with his own hands, 3 tin plates on a shelf. Nothing else, nothing but the loft above dark beyond the wooden pegs driven into the wall as a ladder. He'd take the wood with him. Cobb shook his head once. "Lady, I never could make sense of that man. And I'll tell you the truth because nobody else will." He clicked his tongue and the mules leaned into the harness. You need 4 cords to get through a bitterroot winter. 5 if you want to live easy. 6 if you want to share with a neighbor who runs short. You've got none. And it's the last week of August. How long until the snow? She called after him. He looked back over his shoulder. 6 weeks if you're lucky. 3 if you're not. Last year, the first storm came down on the 10th of October and didn't break for 9 days. He turned forward again. Mrs. Vane, there's a widow named Kastner, runs a boarding house down at Hamilton. Honest rates, takes women with children. You ride a wagon down with me tomorrow morning, you can be there by nightfall. Sell the claim. Take the loss. She did not answer. She stood in the doorway holding her daughter and watched him go. The wagon disappearing among the lodgepole pine, the sound of the wheels falling away into the silence of the drainage. And after a long while, there was only the wind moving high in the trees and the small, even breath of the baby against her chest. The silence came down over the clearing like a lid. Hattie Vane did the only thing she knew how to do. She kept standing. Then she carried Ada inside, laid her on the rope bed, opened the trunk, and began the work of making the dead man's cabin into a place where her child might live. She had been a widow 4 months and 12 days. Her husband Eli had been a clerk at a grain warehouse in St. Paul. A quiet man with reading glasses and a careful hand for accounts. And he had died of a fever that had taken him from health to grave in 9 days in the spring of that year. He had left her with a baby and $98 in a tin box and a brother-in-law who had explained to her gently but very clearly that there was no place for her in his household. She had spent $32 on the train to Missoula. She had spent $8 on the claim. She had spent $6 paying Cobb to haul her up the drainage. She had $43 left. She had a baby. She had a cabin no one had warned her could not be wintered in. She unpacked her bedding. She laid wool blankets over the rope bed and tucked them tight, the way her mother had taught her the way a woman lays a bed to keep the cold from beneath. She set out her 2 cooking pots. She put a candle in a tin holder on the windowsill. She built a small fire in the box stove with kindling she had gathered from the porch boards, and she boiled water in one of the pots, and she made a thin gruel from oats she had carried up the drainage in a sack. By the time full dark came down over the mountain, she had made the cabin into a place, not a home, not yet, but a place where a fire burned, and a baby slept warm, and a woman sat at a table with a tin cup of water and looked at the walls she had bought and tried to think only of the next thing she had to do and not of the long, terrible mathematics that lay between her and the spring. She slept that first night curled around her daughter under 3 blankets, and the stove burned down to coals before dawn, and she woke to a cabin gone cold, and her breath plain on the air in front of her face, and she got up and built the fire back. And that was the first morning. The first week she gathered deadfall. Every morning she wrapped Ada in wool and laid her in the center of the rope bed where the child could not roll off, and she walked into the timber with a canvas sack. Deadfall meant the branches that had already come down dry enough to catch, small enough to carry. She found plenty within a quarter mile. The lodgepole forest had been growing and dying and dropping its dead wood for a century, and the floor of it was a tangle of fallen branches in every stage of decay. She learned which ones to take. The ones that snapped clean were dry. The ones that bent were too green or too rotted. She tested each piece by breaking it across her knee, and what broke crisp went into the sack. She filled the sack 3 times each morning. She carried each load back to the cabin and stacked it against the south wall where the sun would dry whatever moisture remained. She did this until her arms ached and her back stiffened. And then she went inside and fed Ada and held her against her chest until the baby slept again. And then she went back out. By the end of the 2nd week, the pile beside the door reached her waist. She stood looking at it one cool evening with her hands on her hips. And for the space of an hour, she let herself believe that the pile growing was the same thing as the pile being enough. It was not the same thing. She knew it was not. She had stacked her father's woodpile as a girl back in Minnesota, and her father had filled a shed twice this size every autumn, and they had still run thin some winters when the cold had gone down deeper than expected. A waist-high pile of deadfall was nothing. It would burn for 10 days at the rate the box stove ate fuel, maybe 12. But the body keeps working even when the arithmetic has already passed sentence, and Hattie's body worked. She had no other thing to do with her hands, and so she did the work. The neighbor came in the middle of September. His name was Thaddeus Orne, and he lived 2 miles down the drainage, where her creek met a larger one called Bear Creek. He was a big man gone gray at the temples, with hands like split oak and a face weathered to the color of harness leather. His eyes had the deep stillness of a man who had watched too many winters to be hopeful about any of them. He came up the drainage in the middle of an afternoon riding a tall bay horse carrying a smoked ham wrapped in burlap, and he set it on her table without asking the way a man does a thing he has decided is right. "My wife sends it," he said. "Della, she worries about a woman up here alone." Hattie had no coffee, so she boiled water with dried mint and poured it into 2 tin cups, and Orne pretended with her lifting the cup to his face and breathing the steam as if it were the best he had drunk all year, which was a kindness she would remember for the rest of her life. He sat at the small table the dead man had built. His eyes went over the chinking the loft pegs, the box stove the size of the room. They came to rest on Ada asleep in the rope bed. They softened for a moment the way the eyes of a man who has buried a child soften at the sight of one still living. Then they hardened again because he had come up the drainage to do a hard thing, and he had decided not to leave until he had done it. "I met him once." Mooned, Orne turned the cup in his big hands. "Came up to borrow a saw, 3 years back. He stood in that doorway like I'd come to rob him. Wouldn't let me pass the threshold. Didn't say a word for a long minute. Then he said no and shut the door. I never came again. You think he was simple? I think he was a man who had been broken once and had built his life around not being broken again." Orne set the cup down, but I never asked. A man's business is a man's business until he chooses to share it. He looked at her then full in the face. "Mrs. Vane, I have to tell you something you won't want to hear." She waited. "I've lived 11 winters in this valley. My wife's lived 9. He looked at the table now, not at her. "We buried a daughter in the 3rd one, 4 years old. Her name was May. He let that name sit in the room and old Hurt offered up plain. Pneumonia took her in February when the wood ran low, and we couldn't keep the cabin warm enough. We had 2 cords laid by. We thought it was plenty. The cold went deeper than 2 cords. We burned everything by the end of it. The barn door, the wagon seat. And May was 4 years old and her lungs filled. and there was nothing the doctor could do when he finally came up the drainage in March. His voice did not shake. He had told this story to himself enough times that the words came level. I don't tell you that to frighten you. I tell you so you know I am not speaking from ignorance. I understand, she said. You can't stay here. The words fell like stones into still water. The deadfall you're gathering, it's not a tenth of what you'd need. You'd have to fell standing timber, 20-inch lodge poles. Buck them into rounds, split the rounds, stack them where they can season, and you'd have needed to start in May to have any of it dry enough to burn well. Can you swing an axe 8 hours a day until your hands bleed and your back gives out, and then come inside and lift your arms to feed that child? His big hands spread on the table. I've done it. My wife's done it beside me in the years before May and after. It takes 2 strong people from May to October. You came in August, alone. Then what would you have me do? Come down to us before the snow. Bring the baby. We'll make room. Della has clothing for an infant from when our own were small. You can come back here in April and decide what to do with this place when you're alive to decide it. She looked at the walls she had paid $8 she would never see again to secure. She looked at the pile of deadfall by the door. She looked at her daughter asleep, one fist curled against her cheek. I'll think on it, she said. Think quick, Orne said from the doorway. October comes without warning here. One day it's autumn. The next day winter has its hand around your throat. He rode away down the drainage and Hattie stood at the door and watched him go, until the sound of the horse's hooves had faded into the high wind in the pines, and then she went inside and sat down at the table and put her face in her hands. He was right about that. He was right about almost everything. He was only wrong about the one thing that mattered, and it would take the whole winter to prove it. She walked to Darby on the 22nd of September to buy flour and salt, carrying Ada in a sling she had cut from her bedding. 4 miles down the drainage, then the river road, then the town. Darby was not much a single street of board buildings set against the railroad spur with the mill and its drying sheds at the south end. The store sat against the mill's drying shed, and it smelled of fresh pine and tobacco and bacon. And behind the counter stood a man named Garrick Stowe. He was past 40, heavy through the shoulders, with a mustache waxed to points and eyes that took her measure and set a low price on it. He watched her count out coins. You're the one bought the Munn place, he said. Not a question. I am. Aim to winter up there. I do. Stowe laughed. Not cruelly exactly. Something worse than cruelty. Amusement. The amusement of a man watching another person walk slowly toward a hole in the ice that he can see plain and they cannot. That cabin's not fit for wintering Mrs. Vane. Mund never wintered in it. He bunked here at the mill November to March every year for the 15 years I've run this counter. Used the cabin as a summer place, a project. He leaned across the counter and dropped his voice as if to share a confidence. You were cheated, ma'am. The chinking leaks. The stove's too small for the room. And that loft's got nothing under the roof but bare logs and whatever nonsense he was building up there. What was it nobody knows? Guarded it like gold. Some of the boys figured he was counterfeiting up there, hammering coin dies. Some figured he'd just gone soft in the head. How much for firewood? Delivered. $3 a cord. His voice dropped and a thing slid into it that she did not yet have a name for. "But I've got orders for everything the mill cuts through December. Stage stops, ranches, the bank in Hamilton. I can't promise you a single stick before the new year. And by then..." He let the sentence hang. By then the road would be closed. By then she would be dead. "There's a widow named Kastner runs a boarding house up at Hamilton," Stowe said, watching her face. "Takes women with children. Honest rates. You could sell your claim back to the agent. Take the loss. Stay alive." He let it hang there. "I told your Finn the same thing years back his first winter. He said he had all the fuel he'd ever need. We all figured he was crazy." A pause. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he didn't. Either way, he's dead now. Hattie took her flour. She took her salt. She tucked them into the cloth pack she had brought, and she settled Ada against her shoulder. "Lady," Stowe said to her back, and now the edge was bare and shining. "I've worked these mills 15 years. A woman alone with a baby in an uninsulated cabin with no firewood freezes to death. That's not opinion. That's arithmetic." She walked out without a word, but the arithmetic followed her 4 miles up the drainage, multiplying in the dark behind her eyes the whole walk home. 4 cords minimum, none available. $3 apiece if there were any, and there were none. 6 weeks at the most until winter. A baby who had to be kept warm, or she would die. A cabin with chinking she could pass a finger through. And $43 to buy food and lamp oil and cloth from August to April, with no fuel for any price, with the cold leaning already against the mountains. The arithmetic did not stop until she was home with the door shut against the early evening, and Ada laid in the rope bed, and the small fire built up in the box stove from a single armful of deadfall. She sat at the table and watched the fire burn down. She would have 8 days of deadfall left when October began. She had nothing else. On the 28th of September, she climbed into the loft. It was a thing she had been putting off. There had always been a more pressing chore. But on that morning, the air had a bite to it that had not been there the day before, and the sky to the north had a gray weight that her father in Minnesota would have called weather building. And she understood she had been putting it off because she was afraid of what she might or might not find. The wooden pegs had been driven into the wall by the dead man's hands. They were oak harder than the pine of the wall, and they showed the marks of his sledge. She tested the lowest peg with her weight. It held without a creak. She climbed. The loft was dark. The peaked roof rose to perhaps 6 feet at the center and sloped down to 2 feet at the edges. A single small window at the gable end, covered with oiled paper, admitted a yellow glow that fell across the floorboards in a long, thin parallelogram. Hattie pulled herself up onto the loft floor and sat back on her heels and waited for her eyes to find the shape of the thing. The loft was not empty. It was full. Rows of dark shapes stacked in careful columns from the floor to within inches of the sloping roof, marching back into a blackness she could not see the end of. She crawled forward across the rough boards. She put her hand on the nearest shape. It was rough. It was dense. It weighed, when she lifted it, perhaps 3 pounds. She turned it in the slant of light from the oiled paper, and she smelled something sharp and clean and old. Pine pitch. She held it close to her face. It was a rectangle the size of a loaf of bread, 6 inches by 4 inches by 3. The surface was faintly sticky to the touch and bore the faint pattern of a wooden mold. The color was the dark brown of strong tea. When she pressed her thumbnail into the side, it left a small mark, but the material did not crumble. She carried it down the pegs into the light of the room below. She set it on the table beside the candle and looked at it the way a person looks at an animal they cannot name. It was a brick. There was no other word. A brick made of something that looked like sawdust, pressed until it had become almost stone. The smell of pitch came off it like the breath of the forest itself. She climbed back up to the loft. She began to count. 5 rows along the length of the loft, 3 deep, each stack rising 3 feet where the roof allowed. She did rough sums in the dark with her lips moving. The number she arrived at made her stop and made her start again from the beginning, certain she had erred. Thousands. Silas Mund had not been building something in his loft. He had been storing something, brick by brick, Sunday by Sunday for years. The dust on the topmost layer at the back lay thick and gray and undisturbed. The dust on the layer she had taken her brick from was thinner. He had worked his way from the back forward, stacking later bricks atop earlier ones, filling the loft from its dark corners out toward its lighted door. She climbed down. She sat at the table the strange man had built with his own hands, and she set the brick in front of her and she tried to understand what she was looking at. Sawdust. She knew sawdust. The ice merchants in St. Paul had packed it around their blocks to hold the cold through summer. Her grandmother in the old country had spread it on icy paths to give footing. Sawdust was packing. Sawdust was waste. Everyone in the world who had ever tried to heat a house knew that loose sawdust smothered a fire, choked it, killed it dead. But this was not loose. This was pressed into something hard and full of resin that smelled like the heart of a living tree. She carried it to the stove. The fire had burned down to coals. She opened the iron door and set the brick on the coals and waited. Nothing. She waited longer and felt the heat of her own foolishness rise in her face, and she had nearly reached to take the brick away when the corner nearest the coals began slowly to glow. Not flame. A deepening orange like iron coming up to forge heat. The glow spread along the edge. The pitch began to bubble and hiss with the small dry sound of resin meeting heat. And then, all at once, the whole brick caught. The flame ran blue at the base and yellow at the tip, and it did not spark, and it did not pop, and it did not smoke. It only burned steady and hot, hotter than any deadfall she had ever fed. A stove hotter than the seasoned pine her father had cut and dried 2 summers before burning. She held her hand 6 inches from the iron door and felt the temperature climb against her palm. The brick burned 40 minutes. She counted out the time on the small clock she had brought from St. Paul. It burned without slackening, and at last it folded down into a small handful of fine, pale ash. Far less ash than a stick of wood the same size would have left. Hattie stared at the ash. She stared up at the dark mouth of the loft. Thousands of bricks, 40 minutes each. Heat like hardwood and almost nothing left behind. She climbed the pegs again, slower now, and crawled to the far end of the loft. She put her hands on the cold, dense weight of them, stack after stack after stack, and she understood for the first time what the strange man had seen that no one else in the valley had ever seen. They had all looked at the mill's mountains of sawdust and seen garbage. Silas Mund had looked at the same thing and seen winter conquered. But understanding what a thing was did not tell her whether it would carry her through to spring. 6 bricks burned was not 3,000. A clean chimney in September was not a clean chimney in February. She had theory. She had a corpse's silent inheritance. What she did not have was certainty, and certainty was the only currency the cold would accept. Thaddeus Orne came back on the 1st of October, riding the tall bay through the afternoon light, and she met him at the door and held the brick out to him before he had even dismounted. She watched his face move through confusion and into something close to fear. "Where did you find this?" "The loft. There are thousands." He turned the brick over in his big hands. He smelled it. He scraped the surface with his thumbnail and studied what lay beneath. "This is sawdust." "Yes. Sawdust does not burn, Mrs. Vane." "This does. I tested it. 6 pieces over 3 days. It burns hotter than pine and cleaner than anything I've gathered. Nearly an hour from a piece this size and almost no ash." His face hardened not against her, but against the thing itself, against a world that would not stay inside the rules he had paid for in blood. "My father tried to burn sawdust. Everyone has tried. It smothers the fire. It makes smoke that'll choke you, and a baby both. And loose in a loft like that sawdust packed in a closed space, it can catch from a single spark. Spontaneous. It happens in the mills. It's compressed. The pitch holds it. It isn't loose. The pitch." His voice flattened to a blade. "Pine pitch will burn, yes. Pine pitch will also coat your chimney with a tar that catches and burns the cabin down around you in the night. You mean to burn sawdust and tar in a box stove with a single pipe chimney that's been patched 3 times. You will not survive it, Mrs. Vane. I've already survived it. 6 bricks, no smoke, no tar. I went up on the roof yesterday with a rag tied to a pole and pulled it down the pipe, and the rag came back clean." "You burned 6, Orne said slowly. "And you think you know what happens when you've burned 600. The pitch builds up slow. 6 bricks is nothing." Her jaw set. "I think I know. I have no choice. You told me yourself. I can't cut enough. I can't buy any. But there's fuel in my loft, and the man who put it there is the only man who ever understood what he was doing with it, and I mean to learn what he knew." Orne set the brick on the table. For a long moment he was quiet. The fire in the stove popped once. Outside, somewhere in the timber, a jay called and another answered. When he spoke again, the relentlessness had gone out of him, and what was left was tired and old and afraid for her. "Then I can't stop you," he said. "But understand me. If you burn those things, I'm not responsible for what comes. I've warned you plain. I've offered you a warm house. If you choose this instead, you choose it alone." I understand. But she didn't. Not yet. She understood only that she had found her one chance, and that every living soul who saw it told her it would kill her. He left in the slant of late afternoon light. When he had ridden out of sight, Hattie stood in the doorway a long time looking up the dark mouth of the loft above her. She thought of the dead man hammering up there alone Sunday after Sunday for 15 years. She thought of her daughter asleep in the rope bed. There was a thing she had not yet done that she had to do. She had to find out who the dead man had been. She had to find out why a sane person would haul sawdust up a mountain for 15 years and press it into bricks and stack it in a loft and tell no one what it was for. She would have to go and find the dead man. There was no other way. The walk to Hamilton took 8 hours. She left before dawn, leaving Ada with Della Orne and a bottle of goat's milk, and a stammered apology she had not the words to finish. Della had only nodded and lifted the baby from her arms with the slow, careful gentleness of a woman who had once held her own and would never hold them again. Della had not said a word about May. She had not needed to. Hattie went south along the river with the mountains rising on both sides like the walls of a great roofless room. The road followed the Bitterroot climbing gradually through stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, the granite walls closing in and falling back as the river bent. By midday, her feet had gone numb in her boots and her back had locked, but she could see the mill smoke standing over the trees and she kept on. The mill was enormous. 3 buildings along the river. The largest housing a steam-powered saw that screamed every few seconds as it bit into the logs. The screams rolled out across the water and came back off the granite walls and screamed again. Piles of finished lumber filled a yard the size of a city block, and beside the lumber rose the sawdust mountains of it, taller than the buildings, steaming faintly in the cold. Men with shovels loaded some of it into wagons. Others pushed it into the river where it broke apart and drifted away downstream in pale islands. At the yard's edge, a great iron cone burned day and night, pouring smoke into the sky, eating the rest. They were destroying it, burning it and dumping it because they had more than they could ever use. Hattie stood and looked at it for a long time, and a cold understanding moved through her, colder than the air. Every mill in this country was doing the same thing. Every mill from here to the Pacific had been pouring fuel into rivers and burning it in iron cones for as long as there had been mills. And in 15 years, one man had walked past these mountains every working day and seen what nobody else had seen and quietly carried it home in sacks. She asked at the bunkhouse for a man named Lemuel Pike. A thin fellow with bad teeth pointed her toward the river. Lunch he eats alone, always has. She found Pike on a fallen log near the water, a tin pail open beside him. He was past 50, weathered to leather, his beard gone gray in patches. He watched her come without a flicker of welcome. "I'm asking after Silas Mund," she said. "I bought his cabin. I found something in the loft." Pike's eyes narrowed to slits. Then slowly he set down his pail. "You found the bricks." Her heart kicked. "You know about them. I watched him make them. 15 years. His voice came flat without color. "Took the fine dust off the mill floor home in sacks every working day. Built himself a press, a lever thing like a cheese press, but heavier. Mixed the dust with pitch he scraped off the stumps, heated it soft over a small fire, pressed it into a mold. The heat and the weight made it stick. Made it hard. Does it work? How would I know? I never burned one." Pike looked at the river, at the dust drifting past in pale clumps toward wherever the current carried it. "He told me once what he was at. I thought he'd lost his mind. He said cold was a problem a man could solve. said a man who prepared enough would never have to fear winter again. She had come for facts about a process, but sitting on that log by the cold water watching Pike's gray eyes follow the waste downstream, Hattie did something the dead man's coworker had never done. She put the pieces together herself. 15 years, 3,000 bricks. Enough for many winters over. A man who bunked at the mill all winter but climbed a mountain every Sunday to press fuel he would never burn. A man who would not let a soul inside the cabin, who guarded a loft full of bricks, as if it were the only thing standing between someone he loved and the grave. He didn't build them for himself, she said. It was not a question. The words came out of her slow and certain. A man bunks at the mill all winter. He doesn't need 3,000 bricks for a summer cabin. He was building them for someone. Pike turned and looked at her, and something old and grieved came up into his face. He had a wife, Pike said. A girl. Came west with him before my time here. They lived up that drainage the first years. He was quiet a moment. There was a winter. Bad one. He was bunked here at the mill, sending his pay home the way a man does. The road was closed by November, and the cold came down hard and early, and it didn't break. He couldn't get up to them. Nobody could. By the time the road opened in spring, they were both gone. The wife and a girl maybe 2 years old. The fever or the cold or both. He found them himself when he walked up. Hattie felt the bottom go out of the afternoon. After that, he never wintered up there again, Pike said. Couldn't. But every Sunday for 15 years, he climbed that mountain and pressed his bricks and stacked them in that loft. Like he could go back and do it right. Like if he just made enough fuel, it would mean it hadn't happened. He picked up his pail. Last spring, he didn't come down to work. I went up to his bunk and found him there. Heart gave out in the night. He died never having burned a single one. The wind moved off the river and through the sawdust mountains, and for a moment, Hattie could not speak. The loft was not a madman's hoard. It was a monument. It was a man trying to keep a promise to people who were already in the ground and dying with the promise still unkept. Do you think they work? She asked at last. Pike stood. He looked at her a long time. I think Silas Mund was the smartest man I ever knew and the loneliest. I think if he built those bricks to burn, they burn. He started up toward the mill, then stopped. But there's a reason nobody else ever tried it. Sawdust is death in a fire. Everyone knows it. He looked back. You're either the bravest woman in this valley or the most foolish. But if anybody ever did beat a bitterroot winter on garbage, it'd be him. He never did one thing in his life without a reason. She walked the 8 hours home in the dark, with the dead man's grief riding her shoulders like a second child, and she understood now that she was not merely burning fuel. She was finishing something. She was the first warm body to live inside the thing Silas Mund had built his ruined life around. She would not let it have been for nothing. The cold came on the 12th of October, and it came without warning, exactly as they had all promised her. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours. By the time the sun went down, the sky had turned the color of slate, and by midnight the snow came so hard she could not see the woodpile from the window. And by the second day, the thermometer Mund had nailed to the porch post read 42 below zero. Hattie had never known cold like it. The walls of the cabin seemed to breathe ice. The water froze in the bucket. The trees cracked in the timber like rifle fire, the sound rolling off the granite walls. She fed the stove one brick every 40 minutes, and the cabin held at 50 degrees cold. But Living and Ada slept wrapped in every blanket Hattie owned. And then the baby would not eat. Hattie felt it first at the morning feeding. Ada turned her face from the bottle and fussed, and her small face was twisted with a misery she had no words for. Hattie laid the back of her hand against the child's forehead. Warm. Too warm. By noon, the baby was burning. Hattie had seen what fever did to children. She had buried a sister to it once and watched a neighbor's boy go in a week. And here she was, 20 miles from any doctor, with the road under 4 feet of snow, with goat's milk and boiled water and smoked elk and nothing else in all the world. She stripped the child to her cotton shift and bathed her with cool water to bring the fever down. And Ada screamed at the cold, the cries thin and weak. Then she wrapped her and held her near the stove, caught between 2 deaths, the fever that needed cooling and the cold that needed heat. And she fed brick after brick into the fire to hold the room warm enough for a sick child. And she watched the fuel burning down faster than she had ever planned. By evening, the baby had stopped crying. That was worse. A silent child is a child too weak to fight. Hattie held her through the whole black night, feeling the fever pulse in the small body, watching the snow fall, counting bricks in her head, because counting was the only prayer she had left. The fever broke at dawn. She woke to a forehead cool and damp, to even breathing, to color coming back into the small face. And Hattie Vane wept silently so as not to wake her daughter, and fed the stove 3 more bricks, and gave thanks to whatever God had let her keep, the one thing she had left. But the crisis had cost her. She counted what remained, and the number had fallen far faster than her arithmetic had allowed. The fever had eaten a month of fuel in a week. The cold had not broken. And every day the column of figures in her head leaned a little further toward the wall. The second storm came on the 22nd down out of the north, through the passes like a living thing, screaming through the pines, burying the cabin to the eaves. The temperature fell 35 below in the first hour. By midnight it read 49 below, and the stove burning constantly now could not hold the room. 50 degrees, then 45, then 40. At 38 degrees inside, with the cold coming through every crack the dead man had never sealed, Hattie made a decision that no one had taught her, that came to her out of nothing but the desperate clarity of a woman with no options left. She carried Ada up the ladder into the loft. The loft was smaller than the room below, and it was insulated not by any design she could see, but by the mass of 3,000 bricks that filled it, each one holding the heat it had drunk from the cabin's warm air all autumn. She wedged herself into a gap between the stacks, wrapped Ada in every blanket, and built walls of bricks around them against the cold seeping through the bare roof. She could hear the storm tearing at the cabin. She could feel the logs shudder with every gust. But the bricks around her held steady, radiating their stored warmth. And in the heart of that impossible night, she had made herself a cocoon of borrowed heat. They survived it. And in the gray morning, climbing down stiff and hollow-eyed into a room gone to 31 degrees, Hattie understood the last thing the dead man had known and had never lived to tell. The bricks were not only fuel, They were a battery. They drank heat when the fire was high and gave it back when the fire was low. The loft full of fuel was also a wall of warmth, a reservoir, a thing that worked three ways at once: insulation and fire, and stored heat all in one. Silas Mund had not built a woodpile. He had built a machine for surviving every part of it, doing more than one thing. And he had built it for a wife and a daughter he had already lost. Hattie sat down on the floor with the dawn coming gray through the oiled paper. And for the first time, she did not feel alone in the cabin. She felt that she was finishing a sentence a dead man had begun. Garrick Stowe came on foot at the end of October, his horse unable to manage the drifts, his coat crusted with ice, his mustache frozen solid. He stopped 20 feet from the door and stared at the smoke rising from her chimney. And on his face was a thing she had seen on Orne's but turned inside out. On Orne it had been fear for her. On Stowe it was something nearer to insult. You're still alive. I'm still alive. How? The bricks, they work. His face contorted. That's not possible. Sawdust doesn't burn. Everyone knows it. Everyone is wrong. He stood breathing hard in the snow, and then the thing that had been hiding under his amusement came out into the open air at last. I'll tell you something, Mrs. Vane. His voice was low and flat. That claim you're squatting on. I had a buyer, a cattleman out of Butte looking for summer grazing. He'd have paid $40 for it. 40. And then you came along and paid 8 to an agent too green to know what he held. His frozen mustache trembled. You took money out of my pocket. You and that dead fool both. So when you freeze up here, I won't grieve. I'll take the claim off your body and sell it like I should have done in the first place. He turned and walked back down the drainage, punching through the crust. And Hattie understood at last what she had been hearing under his counsel all along. He had never been trying to save her. He had been waiting for her to die, so the cold could do his work for him. And in the weeks that followed, when the snow led a wagon through to the mill, the word came up the drainage that Stowe was telling the valley the widow was already gone, that he'd seen her. That there was no smoke, that someone ought to ride up come spring and see about the claim. He was not merely hoping now. He was working at it. And the cold was working with him. November came like a blade and it did not dull. 20 below on the 1st, 30 below on the 5th, 38 below on the 10th. The cold pressed against the cabin day and night unbroken, searching the chinking for a way in. Hattie settled into the only life there was. Wake at dawn. Feed the stove. Hold the child. Climb to the loft and carry down 20 bricks. Eat what she could: elk broth, the last hard biscuits made from the last of the flour. Feed the stove. Watch the thermometer. Sleep in pieces 2 hours at a time, and wake to the cold creeping back and start again. And the bricks burned. Day after day, week after week, clean and hot, holding the room at 50, while the world outside lay locked in iron. Her hands went rough with handling them. Her back ached from the ladder. Her eyes stung sometimes from a puff of smoke that came back through the stove door when the wind gusted hard against the chimney. But she was alive, and Ada was alive, and the dead man's machine ran on. She talked to him sometimes late when the small hours of the night were the hardest, and she had to feed the stove and could not afford to sleep. She did not believe he heard her. But she talked anyway because she was a living woman, alone in a cabin, built by a dead man's grief, and she had things to say to him that he had earned the right to hear. "I am keeping it warm," she told him. "I am keeping her warm. She is going to live because of you." The fire burned blue at the base and yellow at the tip. The brick gave up its slow, steady heat. And outside, the wind moved down off the granite and laid its hand against the door, and the door held. Then Della Orne came up through thigh-deep snow on the 28th, shaking her face the color of ash, and not from the cold. "The Doyles," she said. "Down at the river fork. 4 children. They ran out of wood 3 days ago." She had to stop to steady herself. The father went out into the storm to cut timber. He didn't come back. Thaddeus found him this morning, half a mile from his own door. Frozen. Hattie closed her eyes and saw it whole. The man struggling through the drifts with his axe, fighting toward the trees that would save his family, and the cold reaching out and taking him before he ever got there, and his children waiting in a house that grew colder by the hour. The children, frostbit. The youngest lost toes, but alive. Thaddeus carried them down to us. We're burning our own reserve to keep them warm. And there are 7 of us under the roof now. Della's jaw tightened against the truth. 3 weeks of wood. Maybe less. Hattie looked up at the loft. She did the figures she had been doing in her sleep. The fever had taken a month. The deep cold was taking more than she'd planned. She did not have enough for herself. She knew it. She had known it for days, and she thought of the dead man who had built 3,000 bricks for a family already in the ground, and who had died with the promise unkept. "Take 200, she said. Della stared. "You need those. I have more." Hattie was already climbing the ladder. "And you have 4 children with frostbite and a family that just buried a father. Take them." She began passing the bricks down. "They burn hotter than wood and cleaner. They'll stretch what you've got. Come back when you need more." Della caught them and stacked them by the door, and her eyes were wet. "Why are you doing this?" Hattie stopped a brick in her hands, and the answer came up out of her plain and certain. "Because if I live through this winter and everyone else dies," she said, "then what was the point of any of it?" When the door had closed behind Della, and the sack of 200 bricks, Hattie climbed back into the loft and counted what was left, and the figure she arrived at on the 15th of December was the one she had been refusing to write down for a month. Enough fuel to last until mid-February. And spring did not come to the Bitterroot until April. She would run out 6 weeks before the thaw. She sat at the table with the numbers in front of her, and she searched them the way a trapped animal searches a wall. She could burn less. Hold the room at 40 and risk the child sickening again. She could burn her old deadfall 2 weeks at the most. She could beg from the Ornes who were already stretched to breaking around the Doyle children. There was no door in the wall. The arithmetic was the arithmetic. She had done everything right. She had given to save the dying, and it had not been enough, and it was never going to be enough. And the cold outside read 41 below, and had not broken since the 12th of October. That night she did not sleep. She sat by the stove with Ada on her lap and watched the brick burn down and put another one in and watched that one burn down too. She thought of the dead man's wife in this same cabin 16 years ago, watching her own fire burn down, with her own daughter on her lap, waiting for the road to open, waiting for a man who could not come. She thought of how close a thing it was between living and not living, how thin the wall. Thaddeus Orne came on a clear, cold morning in the first week of December and stood at her stove, holding his hands over the heat. And the man who had told her in September that she would freeze said the hardest thing a proud old man can say. "I was wrong," he told her. "I came up here in October certain I'd find your body. I told you the bricks would kill you. I did not believe a thing could work, because I had never seen it work." He looked at the fire. "Now I've watched them burn. I've seen my neighbors live on what everyone called garbage. And I am ashamed of every word I said to you, and I am glad past speaking that I was wrong." "You weren't wrong to be afraid for me," she said. "You were looking out for my life. You've done more than survive, Mrs. Vane. You've given this whole valley something it didn't know was there." He paused at the door. "When the spring comes, teach me. Teach all of us. There are mountains of this stuff rotting at every mill in Montana, and men freezing within sight of it." But spring was a long way off, and the numbers had not changed. And Hattie did not tell him that by his arithmetic and hers, she would be out of fuel before the worst of it had passed. The cold broke on Christmas Day. Hattie thought the thermometer had failed. She went out in her coat and boots and stood in the snow and stared at the mercury that had climbed 46 degrees in a single night. It was not broken. She stood in the doorway, breathing air that felt almost warm, watching steam rise off the drifts, listening to meltwater drip from the eaves. 5 degrees above zero. After 2 months below, it felt like the first day of the world. That night, she burned 2 bricks instead of 9, and the cabin held at 58, the warmest it had been since October. On the 26th, it reached 12 above. On the 28th, 22, and she walked out without her coat and turned her face up to the sun. The January thaw had come early, the worst cold snap in 20 years, releasing its grip a month before anyone had dared to hope. And when she sat down and ran the figures again, with the lower burn rate, the answer had changed. She was going to make it. With fuel to spare, she sat at the table a long time with the numbers in front of her, and she did not weep. She had wept enough in October. She only sat and breathed and listened to her daughter making the small, contented sounds of a baby waking warm, and she felt the dead man's hand on her shoulder. And she said to the empty cabin, "Thank you." Garrick Stowe rode up the drainage one last time in the first week of January. He sat his horse in the snow and looked at the smoke at the path she'd cleared at the woman standing in her doorway with her daughter on her hip alive. "You made it," he said. "I made it." He was quiet a long while. Then he climbed down and walked to the porch and took off his hat. And Hattie watched a hard man do a thing that cost him more than money. "I came up here to apologize," Stowe said, "for wanting you dead so I could take this claim, for being a man who couldn't stand the notion that a woman alone might know something I didn't." He turned the hat in his hands. "I've watched the Orns burn your bricks. I've talked to Pike at the mill. I've done the arithmetic, the real arithmetic. They work. And if that dead man figured it out 15 years ago, then every mill owner in this territory has been burning a fortune in his trash heap and never knew it." "That's likely true," she said. Come spring, I want to learn it. I'll pay you. Whatever's fair." Hattie looked at the man who had hoped she would freeze, who had meant to strip the claim from her frozen body, and who now stood hat in hand on her porch. And she understood that the power had moved. It was hers now, and what she did with it was the measure of her. "You won't pay me," she said. "You have the mill. You have the sawdust more than you can burn, and the iron to press bricks 100 at a time, where that dead man pressed them one by one with his hands. Here's my price." She shifted Ada to her other hip. "You make them at the mill, and you give them away free to any soul in this valley who asks. And you help me teach the rest. That's the whole of it." Stowe stared at her. Something moved in his face that was not quite respect, but was reaching toward it. "You could charge for this," he said slowly. "You could be a rich woman. I don't want to be rich. I want my daughter to live, and I want the next widow who buys a cabin at the end of a road that isn't really a road to have a chance." She looked past him to the White Valley. That man built 3,000 bricks for a family that was already gone. He died alone with it. The least I can do is make sure it never happens to anybody else. Stowe put his hat back on. He looked at her a long moment, and she saw in his face the small, painful birth of a thing that had not been there before, and might not have a name yet, but would have one in time. "I'll bring whatever press you need," he said. And he rode away down the drainage, and Hattie watched him go, and felt the whole valley turn beneath her, like a season changing. The road opened on the 15th of March. A wagon made it up the drainage for the first time since October, and the word that had run ahead of it ran back down doubled that the widow on the Munn place had lived through the worst freeze in 20 years, burning nothing but sawdust. By April, a dozen families had sent someone to learn. Thaddeus Orne built the first press from her description, a lever and a wooden mold crude but working bricks that burned 30 minutes instead of 40. And 30 minutes was better than freezing. By May, Stowe had an iron screw press running at the Hamilton Mill, turning out bricks the equal of Munn's from dust that would have gone into the burner bound with pitch the children gathered off the stumps. He gave them away to any who asked exactly as she had told him to. By summer 17, families in the Bitterroot were stockpiling bricks against the coming winter, and the method had run on ahead to Missoula and Helena, and the mining camps at Butte and Mill. Men who had spent their whole lives destroying sawdust, as waste began to look at their mountains of it and see what one strange, grieving man had seen first. Hattie shared everything. She held nothing back. She taught any soul who came, and she never took a coin. And when they pressed money on her, she told them to carry it to the Doyle children instead. She stayed in the valley the rest of her life. She remarried in time a quiet widower of her own, and had more children, and Ada, the baby who should have frozen in that first impossible winter, grew up to teach school in Hamilton for 30 years. But she never forgot the man whose work had saved her. She walked to the Darby Cemetery one spring and found his marker a plain wooden board. The millmen had set over him, and she had it replaced with granite, and she chose the words herself. Silas Mund. He saw what others threw away. She visited the grave every spring. She brought her daughter, and later her daughter brought her own. She told them each time the story of the man who had hauled sawdust up a mountain for 15 years and pressed it into bricks and stacked it in a loft for a wife and a daughter who never came home from a winter to use it. She told them that what saved her had been built by a man's grief, and that grief, if a man let it, could become a gift to someone he would never meet. She told them that nothing a person did in love was ever wasted, even if the person it was done for did not live to see it. And in the valley, they told the story for years after she was gone. They told it the way men tell the stories that matter, slow around a fire in the deep of winter, when the cold leans against the windows and a man is glad of his warm house. They told of the widow who came in August with nothing, who climbed into a loft everyone swore would be her tomb, who burned a dead man's garbage through the cruelest winter in living memory, who gave it away to her freezing neighbors when she had not enough for herself, and who walked out into the spring sun with her daughter on her hip, standing in the doorway of a cabin that should have been her grave. The smoke rose from the chimney. The snowmelt ran bright at her feet, and Hattie Vane was alive,